Welcome to the State of the Nation with me, Mike Sham. We spend a lot of time talking about politics. We spend a lot of time talking about economics. And what we don't spend enough time talking about is the social impact of the failures of politics and economics. And it's about time that in South Africa we do look at these issues. And somebody who is out there trying to make a difference is the Social Policy Initiative, and that is led by, or certainly one of the people involved, is Isobel Frye. Isobel, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's an honor to be here.
Slowly with the honor.
I'll tell you at the end.
Yeah. A lot of people started that way. Anyway, Isobel, tell us about the work that you do.
Sure. I run a feminist social security policy think tank, and what we do is, through research and analysis, attempt to look at ways in which the social security system in South Africa could be more adequately developed, rolled out. And in essence, we were talking just before the show about safety net. What we want to see is the constitutional right of access to universal social security become a reality for everybody. And so we work very closely alongside government. We very frequently agree with what government's doing, and there are times when we encourage them to think differently, to act differently. And it's been a relationship that we've been able to build up over the years. We work with civil society and we work with business. I'm one of the representatives of community constituency at Nedlac. So we really have direct access to the policy debates that take place there. And in essence, it's about trying to ensure that through empirical evidence, we're able to create solutions to the quagmire that you mentioned, the poverty, inequality, and unemployment, in order to get South Africa onto the road of prosperity and equality that we're all committed to.
Do you think Nedlac is still fit for purpose? Because it seems to be a group of people getting together, not sure who they're trying to serve, but they seem to not move the needle at all. At what point do we say Nedlac is a big failure?
So that wasn't one of the questions that we agreed to talk about.
Yeah.
Nedlac's history is located in the 1995 Labour Relations Act, and it was an essential, intentional space to create sufficient trust amongst people who just a year before had still been warring partners to be able to negotiate in good faith. It's based on the International Labour Organization's principles of social dialogue, which are really necessary in order to get agreement and compromise. I think if you look where we are now, there's certain victories. I mean, there was the LRA. I was involved with a COVID-19 task force, which we met daily for the first number of months, and were able to negotiate, I think, a much less chaotic response. And another great success that not because I was involved, that I was involved with, was the national minimum wage negotiation. So I think when one comes together on specific issues, it has had successes. Whether they are new ways of operating, whether everybody is sufficiently represented, is another question. I think, for instance, informal traders, do they fall under organized business or organized labor because they're own account workers, or civil society, which is not business oriented? And I think where you have people left out of debates, the debate is much weaker. So Nedlac's just had a summit and a kind of recognition of its successes, and I think it is also a chance to look at what a future oriented social dialogue platform could be like.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, I'm always terrified when I hear about these business bodies that claim to speak for business, because they're speaking for big business, and big business has got institutionalized business. They work almost like efficient parastatals rather than businesses. You know, they don't really follow normal business practices because they've got monopoly control. Through Nedlac, they get to write the legislation. Everything is in favor of our established business community, who get to set their own, rules and to hell with the rest of the economy. So I'm no fan of those business bodies. I've had poor old Cass Kuvadia here trying to explain to me how they talk for business, and I don't think is at least informal business gets a hearing, but small and medium enterprises don't even have a voice at the table. So, to me, that's the big gaping wound in the South African business firmament, and that's why I question as to whether Nedlac has any relevance, because I don't see people that represent the bulk of the economy being having a seat at the table. But I digress. You're not here to talk about business.
Not an apologist for Nedlac, but yes, I hear you.
Yeah, I have some issues about the way that it is. But
actually, just to go back to that, the idea of social dialogue is a very good one, where there is an equalizing of interests. And an ability to see the benefit of compromise. But equally so, then you have to have everybody who's going to be bound by the outcomes of negotiations around the table. So I think I would encourage you to have Lisa Seftel, the ED, Executive Director of Nedlac here. I think she would be a good guest.
Okay, we'll try that one on. But let's go back, because, I know that you were instrumental in some of the things that have come through minimum wage, which, by the way, I'm actually, sort of a fan of the minimum wage, because really the minimum wage in South Africa is minimum.
Absolutely.
And, do you really want to pay people less than that? That's on you, not you, but a business person that complains about the minimum wage. I don't see that as being the problem. But South Africa has got a massive number of people that are unemployed that depend on the state. And you have been involved in trying to make those people's lot in life better. What do we do about the South African social problem?
It's a really big issue. And I think in my view, if we don't solve for that, to use business language, to solve for problems, if we don't manage to address that, then the success of any government and any future plans are at risk. The analysis that we start off with, as you say, just looking at the statistics of people unemployed and people living in poverty, we come from a past where labor, where the state regulated labor, so that we would have vast pools of underskilled workers who were able to work the mines, agriculture, under the apartheid system. And one of the things that emerged for me very clearly when we were doing the national minimum wage negotiations was how little that apartheid wage structure and labor market structure has effectively changed for the majority of people. So in the days of the Bantustans, you would have families, black families, living in rural areas that today are very much the rural provinces with low employment. And the migrant male workers the breadwinners would come to the cities and then sort of take a little bit of money home. So once we had a sort of reunification of South Africa in 1994, we needed to address the unemployment question, and that's not been something which has really come to the fore. In 1998, there was a presidential job summit under President Mandela, and COSATU, as the Labour Union Federation, raised the question of future unemployment. And one of the responses that was agreed upon was the establishment of the Taylor Committee, which was a committee of inquiry looking at comprehensive social security. So this is my digression of an answer. So already the question of how we create employment, full employment, was problematized. And in response to that, people were saying we need to have a social security system that enables people to have a safety net in the event of us not being able to reach full employment. Now, full employment is not something that I think we or many other countries in the developing world will be able to attain. We've got, if we look at the broad expanded definition of unemployment, that's 42.6 million people, 42.6% of the labor market who are unemployed, which is 12.4 million adults. We don't use the more narrow definition of unemployment because that excludes discouraged work seekers. And I think that if you are if you've given up looking for work, that certainly doesn't render you employed. You still stay unemployed even if you're discouraged. So we have a huge segment, almost 50% of able-bodied adults not employed. We also know that in terms of poverty, one of the greatest drivers of poverty in South Africa is the lack of employment. On the one hand, so people just not in the labor market, and then secondly, low wages. As you said, the payment to pay someone less than 4,600 Rand a month for a full-time job is not only mean, but it screws up the economy. Because I think we're going to get to that, is the role of having secure income circulation in order to have a healthy economy. So we have many people outside of the labor market, which also means that we have people who are unable to be full active economic citizens. We have as well the highest inequality in the world, which means, well, we're an upper middle income country, so we have resources, but it's the distribution of those resources that is particularly skewed. The richest 10% of people in South Africa command 52% of income. The poorest 50% have 10%. So when you see, and if I had a stick and a blackboard, I would draw the graph. When you see the curve of that graph, even between the 9th and the 10th income decile, you get a jump of 19% of the distribution to 52% of the distribution. It's not sustainable. You need to have people who have access to income in order to spend, so that you have that virtuous cycle of a circulating economy. So in essence, the cause of the problem might be historic, but we're seeing its manifestation today. And the impact of it on our future needs to be shaken up. And that's really where the social security comes through. I love social security. I also love the idea of a welfare state. And this is really what brought me into looking at poverty, was when I was working at the Trade Union Federation, COSATU, just looking at what is to be done, the big question of people. And the Beveridge Report, which came out in the UK in the middle of the Second World War, identified 5 ills, and that was unemployment, lack of housing, lack of income, education, and healthcare. Those 5 pillars really describe a modern industrialized democracy that is functioning. Because you need to have healthy, educated people who are in jobs in order to get income. And the housing, of course, is what holds the household together. And income became something which I looked at and studied quite with a lot of interest, because it's both it's a thing in and of itself, and it's an enabler. So if you look at the South African Constitution, there, Section 27(1)(c) guarantees the right to social security to everybody, and food, and water, education, and healthcare, and housing. In a society that is as urbanized, proletarianized as South Africa, because of the forced removals from the land, which decimated the black peasantry in the late 1800s, beginning of 1900s, people are cash-based, and with a lack of cash, the lack of looking at alternatives, it's really problematic. You mentioned SMMEs. I mean, one of my big arguments with the state is you can't just push young people to be entrepreneurs, to give them SMME training, if nobody is able to afford the goods and services that they're providing. And we did an 18-month pilot in Everton, which is the oldest established township in Gauteng, just before COVID. And we worked with women who were grant recipients, so they were getting a child support grant for their children, and were micro-entrepreneurs. So there's certain skills that people do need to have. They need to know how to price things so you're not running at a loss. They need to understand the benefit of separating household income from your business income, reinvesting. But at the end of the day, you need to have neighbors who can afford to buy what you have.
I personally don't think that oddly enough, I'm a big believer in the fact that we don't have the problem of people understanding how to price things, how to separate their finance. In actual fact, I've made this point before, is nobody can live off the current grant without starving to death. And people aren't starving to death in the kind of numbers that they should be, if one could use a sort of a callous term, which must mean that they're doing something extra, which must mean that they're managing their money very carefully. You know, nobody manages their money better than a poor person.
Absolutely.
Right? So, we've got many problems. I don't know if the management of money is one of them. I mean, we've certainly got a problem when it comes to the management of money by the state, which seems to burn through money inefficiently as can be. You mentioned the 5 pillars that came out all the way back in the 40s in the Beveridge Report, and just about each one of those is a national competency. In other words, a state-run competency, and they've been incompetent at just about every one of them. The only one that I suppose falls outside of their thing is income, right? But they failed on housing, they failed on education, they failed on healthcare. And their solution to just about every one of those is more state control when they haven't even controlled the stuff that is under their control. So, you know, I know that you had an involvement with some of the unions in South Africa. What did they say about the disastrous performance of the state in these vital issues, vital places that the state is meant to manage? I mean, the union in many cases are the people responsible for the demise. If one looks at education, one looks at healthcare.
So I'm not speaking on behalf of the unions. I think there are different ways of looking at that. I know from being part of progressive civil society as well, and including the labor movement, that to blame the unions for underperformance is really just looking at one source. I mean, shortly after, when GEAR was introduced in 1996, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Policy, that moved away from the Reconstruction and Development Program, which looked, so the RDP's premise was that we would have growth through redistribution, that through redistributing the assets that were in the country, we would ensure that everybody had a basis for livelihood. GEAR came in with a sort of neoliberal idea that you had to cut in order to grow. So you would have redistribution of the growth that ensued, which is great if you're having growth.
Well, we were during GEAR.
And before the global financial crisis, there definitely was a much stronger growth than we have. But what that also entailed was cutting the civil service. So if you come from a time when the public service, the bulk of it was there to serve a minority of the population, suddenly it needs to service, what was their population then, about sort of 50 million. Yeah. And you are then cutting. Do you remember the teachers? I mean, there was the package, the retrenchment package. The state offered to teachers the ability to retire early with a great incentive to get them off the books. And we know what happens when there's an incentive, is that the best people leave, leaving the lesser trained.
But that was to achieve a political aim. It wasn't like all teachers were being offered those packages.
It was an offer to reduce the public service, and that has happened.
Well,
so
it was let's be fair, it was social engineering. It was to get rid of white teachers, wasn't it?
Well, that's your view. It's not my view. But what my point that I'm making is the public sector wage bill is something which the government is continually told to cut, whether by the World Bank and the IMF. And so you have fewer and fewer people serving a growing population. And so if you don't have enough people at the forefront, sort of frontline service people, then the conditions of work are really poor. So you have one teacher in some township schools needing to teach 60 kids. No one with the best ability the best skills, the best pedagogical training is going to be able to curtail that, especially when the kids are hungry, when they come in where there's little discipline because there's also disruptive home life. So what I'm presenting is the fact that there are a number of combinations that lead to the areas, the fact that we have disaster in state health, we have disaster in state education, and a variety of different functions of the public, of the social wage, the main delivery of the state. So I think we have areas of agreement there. And then the question is how we move, and possibly under the government of national unity, to look at different modalities in which people public servants have a better understanding of their relationship with both people they're serving and the state. And citizens have a better understanding of what they're entitled to.
Yeah, because there's also the question of efficiency, I suppose, which is sort of the major gripe of people that argue against an increased wage bill. Is, am I getting bang for my tax buck? Right? Is the country getting value for money? You know, we know that, and you don't speak for the unions, but we know that SATU refused to have inspectors at schools, standards, etc. Right? So, you know, you see a decline in standards, which by their own measure we've got baked into the system now, but absolutely no will to repair the efficiency of these bodies that are out there to serve the people. You know, so an organization like yours, which is out there to improve social life for South Africans, what do you say to government about their own efficiencies within these services that they run?
We don't work in education and healthcare, so we don't really engage with the state on that. But there are different ways in which we do engage with the state on efficiency. And just going back to Social Security, one of the big gripes that we have with Minister of Finance and his ministry is the question of targeting, means testing. We were talking earlier about entrepreneurs and the way that social grant recipients, as you said, if you look at the amount of the grant, so the child support grant is 530 Rand. We all know you can't raise a child on 530 Rand. So the question is how do people survive beyond that? And we, in fact, with the UN SDG Fund, we produced a documentary following grant beneficiaries and just exploring their lives with the grant income and how that's used. And the problem is that as soon as people start using that grant to generate more income, it gets cut because they suddenly have income above a very low threshold. I was in Mpumalanga, Graskop, and I was talking to a builder, an informal builder, and a very typical South African story, orphaned at a young age. He lived in Bushbuck Ridge. He came to Joburg. He, I suppose, informally apprenticed with a builder here, got skills. The person he was working with died. So again, a young person without any safety net. He sort of gravitated back home. But as soon as he applied for the 350 grant, as it was then, and he got it. And he went to the hardware store and said, I have money coming in next month. Can I get credit? And the hardware store guy was very sort of understanding and said, yeah, of course. He saw that he would be getting a whole lot of work there and income. And so the guy got credit, started building houses. I think he had, because for the poor, things like privacy don't exist. So Treasury and SASSA are able to go into the bank accounts of every person who gets a grant. Saw that he was getting an income of, I think he got 1,000 Rand for the payment. He lost the grant, he lost the credit, he lost his income. So if we're wanting to encourage people to be successful entrepreneurs, we should not penalize them. I mean, the means test is punitive. If you use your incentive, you lose it. So our challenge to them is, to treasuries, how can we design a social security system that actually rewards? So if Mike is getting the COVID 370 grant and you have a successful podcast and you get a sponsor coming in, possibly you could get airtime in order to promote your business. And so you get that positive cycle. And that's the mindset that we don't have. We don't have the idea of pursuing opportunities, also trying new things, because I've done some ventures which haven't worked, but because I have a small safety net of salary, it didn't wipe me out. So those for me are where government is inefficient. Those are the inefficiencies I deal with, is to say, how can we think differently? How can we learn from other countries?
Now, you mentioned that Mike may have money coming in because he's got a sponsor in his podcast. We do. We've got Pace Car Rental. They give a discount to anybody that's watching this. If you go through their website and use the code SONA, S-O-N-A, for State of the Nation, you can get a discount on your next car hire. So support us because they're supporting small business. Oh,
There you go.
That was neat,
very smooth. Yeah.
Well done, well done. You led me into that. But let's go back to this, because what you're mentioning is a global problem. I was actually just watching something on the John Oliver show where they were giving an American example that was almost word for word exactly the same situation as you have. The law is written, you can get a certain grant or a certain thing. In this case, they're looking at a disability thing, but as the minute you get money and it goes $1 over a certain number, you lose your grant. Now, the only way one can do away with that is with something like a basic income grant, i.e. a sum of money that gets paid to everybody, isn't it? And regardless, we don't care whether you're a millionaire or poverty-stricken, you're going to get your X amount of money, right, forever.
I can see where the but is coming in, absolutely. And the reason why it is so efficient is because it gets given to everybody. But it gets clawed back through the tax system from people who are earning a certain amount. And the reason why this is such an efficient system is, firstly, in social policy parlance, you have areas of exclusion and areas of inclusion. So currently, government treasury is very concerned about areas of inclusion, people who are getting grants who shouldn't be. The person who's earning R1 more than the means test. Social development is very worried about areas of exclusion. The children who are not getting it because their mum or their granny isn't able to negotiate the complexity of SASSA applications and proving that you don't have an income. Do you know you've got to go to the police to get an affidavit to say that you have no income? I mean, how inefficient is that? It's like black bins and the police time. But the point about a universal, unconditional grant is that it goes to everybody. If you are registered on the system. So that is a way of getting people in the informal economy
into the tax net
to become formalized, exactly, because the benefit is immediate. We always say to people in the informal economy, there is a benefit of formalizing. For them, it's actually a huge hurdle, and they don't see immediate. So you get everybody into the system. We know how many people we have. We know where they're spending. There's a huge amount of retail data, which is beneficial for the private sector. And we also know that we can solve for poverty overnight, and you get that money coming back through SARS. So it's a negative means test. So it doesn't mean that the millionaire sits on her 1,500 and gets her nails done once more, or whatever millionaires do.
Yeah, us millionaires, we get our nails done all the time.
You can see that while you're hiring a car.
Yeah, while hiring a car. But Isobel, it sounds wonderfully efficient. It's done in a few places. And isn't the problem that we keep on looking at those places and we don't compare everything? So, for example, you ask most people involved in your world, they'll immediately turn to Scandinavia. So there's socialist states. But nothing could be further from the truth. Those countries have got a social net, but they're ruthlessly capitalist countries. Support businesses, right? Make it very easy to start a business, to run a business. Very homogenous societies, very closed societies, right? Do you think it's reasonable for South Africa to even look at Nordic countries?
I was interested that you said ruthlessly capitalist.
They're ruthlessly capitalist.
But
please.
I was actually going to say that most people in my position don't look north. We look south to Brazil, which is a country which has a much greater population than ours, but in terms of numbers. But they were on par with us in terms of inequality. I think in the early 2000s, and the Workers' Party came in and introduced something known as the Bolsa Familia, which is quite similar to a basic income, although it's not universal. But let me go back to the question of Scandinavia. They are definitely homogenous societies, closed societies. And very prosperous societies. But the interesting thing is
prosperity doesn't come out of their social programs.
No, but you see,
yes.
There was a co-development between their social security and their prosperity. I mean, if you look at Sweden, about 120 4 years ago now, because I was over for the celebration of the centenary. No, so 106 was before COVID. 106 years ago, they introduced a universal pension, old age pension. Sweden, Finland, and Denmark were really poor countries. I mean, that's why there were so many people emigrating to the US. There were famines, and it's not a great country to try and grow food in all the year round. So they realized that they collectively lay in a prosperous community. And so they intentionally built up. So when the old age pension in Sweden was introduced, it was universal. The amount was minuscule, but the principle was universality. And if you look at what's known as the Nordic way in terms of social policy, it is based on prosperous inclusion. Yes. So saying that you can't, and that's the difference, for instance, between Sweden and the UK. We were talking about liberalism earlier on. And the UK is a classic example of a liberal social democracy, social welfare state, because they have very strong elites. They have a safety net, but it's a very, very minuscule one. So there are few people who can actually traverse from getting benefits in the UK to a rich society. Whereas in Nordic countries, as you say, they're very, very wealthy people. I mean, there's a strong monarchy, there is a very capitalist state, but there is also a sense that well-being has to be a collective thing. So you have taxes that are paid. And yeah, you've got very efficient public services because everybody's dependent on them. If we closed, and this is an argument I always have, I think every public servant should have to use the state. And this is not spy, this is me. Yeah. The state's healthcare and also state education, because we know from across the world, if you look at the literature, that where the middle classes are involved, you and I, people who have a voice, we will not sleep until the teacher is disciplined, the nurses are acting as they should, and the medication is in the clinic. So you were saying, why do we look north? I'm saying there are some principles that we can gather, but I agree that we need to be looking at countries that have similar societal challenges. And yes, Brazil is one that really benefited from an intentional. They had a sort of 3-stage package, which was a national minimum wage, collective bargaining, and a Bolsa Familia. So I think that we have scored on that. But the other thing that I want to come to is the question of, and this comes from the liberal versus sort of social democratic idea, what are benefits? And if you look, for instance, at the minuscule 370 Rand, which is the COVID grant, the 370 is the new 350. Yes. Let's not joke about something which is so appalling. Yeah. Old age pension, 2,018 Rand. At SPY, we developed we monetized the amount of a decent standard of living, which was done democratically through focus groups, and asked people what is important to live a life of dignity. Not a very rich life, but not scraping by. And the amount is 6,034 Rand. So people who have that as a median income are associated with people who have the proxy indicators that we had for a life of dignity. So 6,000 Rand. And yet our income, our benefits are incredibly low. We've done further work at SPY looking at the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, and looking at the financing of it. And ironically, you've actually got to raise the level of the benefit in order to have a virtually self-financing system. So where you pay a decent income replacement, or income, because I mean, if it's not a replacement, everyone gets it. There's a sweet spot which starts, in effect, through the multiplier, reproducing itself at sufficient times for it to have to raise the GDP growth. So we had it modeled using econometric modeling, that if you have a universal basic income, which is the same amount as the upper bound poverty line, which is now 1,634 Rand per person per month, you can, after 3 years, you would have GDP growth of about 5% and be able to create 2 million decent jobs. And so be, in effect, 96% self-financing.
Yeah, but what you would also have, unless you have a strong economy underpinning this, is you're going to have rampant inflation. that will come from the printing of money, because that's the only place it'll come, because it can't come from taxation. And God knows in South Africa it's not going to come from the government cutting its spending. So therefore, we would have a declining currency. We'd have an increase in imports as people would want to buy television sets and stuff that makes our lives nicer. Right? So I'm saying that you can't view that in isolation, because there are definite knock-on effects economically to doing that, which I get the picture. I understand economics, right? But one can't minimize the fact that we're going to give, let's say, 6,000 Rand times 40 million per month.
1,600.
Okay, so that's 6,000. Okay.
So that was a different. That was just a marker of what a decent life is.
So
saying even
we talk about 50 billion Rand per month, let's just say, or 40 billion Rand per month. That's going to go into consumption, which is good for the economy, but it's also going to be printing of money, which has to come from somewhere. So, and so what I'm saying is it feasible in a place where a government is so hostile to the private sector?
So I think just to unpack some of your assumptions around the micro policies, but also the inflation. So I think firstly on inflation, we need to recognize that there is a huge undercapacity of our production. So if you look at Stats SA's business confidence and studies, factory owners say that they're producing at 20% below capacity. And when asked to attribute why, is it because of costs, etc., they say because of demand.
Yes.
So we currently have capacity for greater production, which would not lead to immediate inflation. I think the other point about printing money is, I think that's quite orthodox and old school. I think if you look at more modern monetary theory, for instance, you're able to look at ways of freeing up existing money. So take, for instance, so on the model that we have, yes, you need an initial injection. That's the stimulus, because the multiplier works on the stimulus, which is why we say over 3 years, you do a universal grant at the lower bound poverty line, or the food poverty line of 760 Rand, then the lower bound, and then the upper bound. Where does that money come from? Now, we're one of the few countries in the world that has a fully paid government employee pension fund. So we have enough money for every single public servant to retire tomorrow and have their pensions paid out. Where the way that modern economies work is as pay as you go. So those who are retired today are paid for by the public servants who are working today and tomorrow. We are so that money is sitting. It's being invested offshore. It's not being invested for kind of public priorities. So that's one source. The UIF has a surplus of over 100 billion. And of course, that money, as we know, belongs to the workers and the employers. So the state's not entitled to that. But there are ways of looking at accessing monies that have been kind of put aside and are not being used. And that's just, if you look at the PIC balance sheet, I mean, you'll know the trillions of Rand that are there. And looking at ways in which you take down from allocated funds in order to reach a national development. So not taxing and not printing money either. But so that's on the one hand is the financing. One of the things that we feel very strongly about, however, is we don't want to see this money being sucked out through ShopRite and other township retailers in township areas and going to China and places that are producing at a much lower rate. So there definitely is a need to have micro policies looked at in industrial trajectory policy growth. And there, the idea of bringing in green manufacturing. So anticipating the kinds of needs, if everybody in this country is getting 1,600 overnight, where will the spending be? And that's the really exciting work that can be done. So what kind of foodstuffs do we want to start producing? Where are we going to produce it, anticipating climate change? Is the Free State still going to be in the grain basket? If not, where is that going to happen? And then in addition to that, looking at the kinds of production that we can do. And so we circulate, because the multiplier only works if the money circulates before it's sucked out. So how does that happen? Where are the smaller trades and services being housed at a local government level? We know that local government has a huge amount of money that's dedicated for local economic development. It doesn't get spent because there is no LED. So activating those idle pools, because people know what it's for.
I just wonder if we wouldn't achieve just about everything we need if we did the second part first, and just got the government to not strangle us in red tape when it comes to any business in South Africa, which is a whole discussion for another day. Because in essence, the second part to what you're saying is, I understand the multiplier effect. That's great, and I agree completely. That can only work if, as you say, the big chains aren't buying from China, etc. Well, what's going to stop that the thing that's going to stop that is efficient production within South Africa, with entrepreneurs getting access to doing business without months of red tape and KGB bureaucratic systems which seem to bedevil us. But that's not what you're doing. You're out there to try and help people at least get through the day and the week and the month.
Yeah, or don't forget, I started SPY, so I am fully on board with sympathies around red tape. I mean, that's one of the things I say is I was a corporate lawyer before I moved into civil society, and if I hadn't had that experience, there's no way I would have successfully negotiated the hurdles or understood what the implications were. But I think in South Africa, as in many places, it's easy to find a false binary, either one or the other. And what I've experienced in discussions at a government level is people talk about either the economy or people. And I like what you were saying is, and in how you put it, is that we do need to ensure that people have food on the table, that there is well-being. And we need to. So it's an and, not an or. We do need to look at the economy. We know that from qualitative research we've done, but as well as global literature, there is a psychological benefit from having a job, from being recognized as contributing to society. There is a shaming that comes from not being able to work. And that's something that we need to ensure that people have the ability to do. What terrifies me is when you move into communities where you have 3 generations of people in a house that have never had employment, because there is a ability and understanding of the world of work which gets lost. And if you look at
and the shaming gets lost.
No.
Because everybody's in the same boat. How can you shame the guy next door?
From the conversations I've had with people, it doesn't ever go. And there is a desire to do more, to do better. But I think part of the question of the society that we want to move towards, we need to put those foundational issues in place. We want to see that people have economic activities and livelihoods. We want to know that there is a pride in contributing tax. And we want to know that there is an ability to hold government to account on those areas that you have raised, and where people come across inefficiencies, corruption, or those kind of, and you can call it petty corruption, but corruption starts with the traffic cop that you bribe. Corruption starts with an official, because you can't get the red...
I didn't even know you were watching me. So.
Because you can't get the red tape.
Yeah.
And so you do that. And it cuts across race and class. Trying to get, let me not put that on air. Yeah. Just a dinner, whether you are doing focus groups or dinner parties, the conversations are the same.
Now, Isobel, you, just in closing, you sit in many august meetings with people that really care or say they care. Do you have any understanding as to why our government cares so little about these issues, that the government will not see the solutions that are so apparent? Do you have any grasp on what it is that stops them from doing the right thing?
I like the third way that you articulated that question. It is perplexing and it's challenging. I can tell you the theoretical responses, having studied comparative countries and their policies. There is at heart something known as path dependency, which is if you're sitting in an office, you prefer not to deviate from what your predecessor did because there's a high risk attached to doing something differently. So a lot of people who have the ability to change path don't do so because they might fail. So then that's where the mediocrity kind of sinks in as being what's good enough. I think in addition to that, there's a strong sense of obeying the diktats that the World Bank and the IMF give, and the credit ratings. So people don't, so government gets told not to spend money on its people, to cut the public sector wage bill, not for the right reasons. There might be reasons of efficiency, etc., which you and I disagree with, but just being told to do it because of the conditions of some external funding sourcing is not the right reason. And I think that this election, the most recent election, was an interesting one because I think it's clear that the ruling party heard that people were dissatisfied with it. And I really look forward to the committee work in Parliament, the oversight work of the new government of national unity on those line departments in terms of their performance and their delivery.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, for the first time you saw a guest on the show try and kill me because she mentioned modern monetary theory, which is a whole discussion for a different day. But I do think that South Africa will prosper if there is a good safety net. I was saying to Isobel before we went on air that I grew up in an era as a white South African. They did have a safety net. I knew where I would go to if I broke my leg, to a relatively efficient government hospital. I went to a government school. These were all things that myself and my parents didn't have to worry about. I did come out there with a reasonable education. I can read and write. I can add and subtract. So I do see the benefit of having some social services. I think what is at odds is to achieve what SPY would love to achieve, which is where people feel that if the worst happens, they're not going to starve to death, freeze to death, and have children that can't go to school or hospitals. So it's up to us, but it's important that we keep on talking, keep on holding government to account, which we're going to keep on trying to do on the State of the Nation, and keep on seeing what stops business from growing, because where Isobel and I might differ in our approaches would be, I think that we dramatically need to increase the size of this economy. And under the current set of rules of engagement in this country, it's impossible to achieve. All the stores that you see open, all the offices that you see vacant, will not suddenly get filled up just because we have a government of national unity, because no government in the world could run a successful economy with the rules that we have in place. But that is just my considered opinion. In the meantime, while we wait for that, people have to live on 370 Rand a month. It's a disgrace. Isobel, thank you so much for coming on to the State of the Nation, giving us a different view of what we should be looking at on the social side. We must keep monitoring this, keep on giving it air. Maybe somebody will hear. And thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you very much for inviting me. And just to say to the audience that we agree on having a growing economy. And that was the point of our UBI, is a growth of 5% is a minimum for what we want to see for this. How we get there, we'll continue to talk about. But I think we're committed to saying we've got the potential. We've got huge, so many resources. It's how we unlock them. To the business people out there, a massive unemployment rate is a massive opportunity for other people to start businesses by servicing those people. So that is the grey cloud that has a silver lining in South Africa. To everybody that's joined us today, support Pace Car Rental, subscribe to the State of the Nation. Isobel, thank you for joining us. Thank you. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation.